A lot of times when people do glute bridges, there's a couple of things I see go wrong very commonly. The first is that they just end up pushing their hips up into the air without really much consideration for what's happening between the relationship of their pelvis and their rib cage. So we need to make sure that these things are stacked to allow the glutes and hip extensors, like the hamstrings too, to do their jobs. The other thing is that they don't really care about what's going on their feet. They'll roll all over the place. They'll lose their heels, their toes, roll on the outside of their feet, whatever. So many things could happen here. But if we want to improve our hip extension or use our glutes in the best way we can, and our hip extensors in the best way we can, we need to think about what's going on at all of these places. And it's easier than it sounds. Here's a couple of ways that you can do that. Glute bridges are one of the most common corrective exercises that we see get programmed for just about any type of lower body pain, whether that's knee pain, hip pain, or even low back pain. We see this programmed all the time. It's one of those blanket exercises. However, there's two very common issues with this exercise. The first is that it's often not executed very well. And the second is that there's not much appreciation for individualization and what some people may need more so than others. Let's start with the latter point because it will feed into the first point. And on the surface level, it makes sense. And I like how people are trying to retrain hip extension, which that's what the glutes do. So ideally with this exercise, what people are trying to do is if someone is in, let's say, an anterior pelvic tilt, their hips are in a position of hip flexion, we want to get stress off of the low back, train the glutes to extend the hip fully. However, there's not much appreciation for whether someone actually needs glutes first as the primary hip extensor or hamstrings first, because the proximal hamstrings that attach up here and on the back of the pelvis on this ischial tuberosity, also because they can contract here, pull the pelvis underneath into hip extension as well. Now, ultimately, when you are doing hip extension, you are going to get a contribution from both the glutes and the proximal hamstrings, but depending on how much hip extension is available, we can start with one more than the other. So let's say someone has a lot of anterior pelvic tilt. They have a position where they're not actually able to move into full hip extension. If they try to move into full hip extension, then they're just going to end up extending their back instead because they haven't educated their body how to move into a fully hip extended position. That's going to be very hard for them to do. So for these people, what we actually want to start with usually is the hamstrings. And we want to put them in a position where they can leverage those hamstrings effectively. So we have to ask, does this person have a lot of hip extension available to us? And if the answer is no, we're going to probably start with the hamstrings and a slight tilt, and then progress them to something that's in more in-range hip extension after that. But regardless, people tend not to use this position very effectively because there's a couple of things we need to take into account. First is we need to maintain the contacts of the foot in order to extend the hip. Let me explain what I mean by that. When we're standing, we're in a position of hip extension. We should have 3 foot contacts primarily available to us: the heel, the first metatarsal head right here, and the fifth. Not only that, but once we push off in gait, this is a position of hip extension as well. So this requires us to strike the ground with the lateral border of our heel, and we'll transition to more of the inner heel and this first met head as the arch flattens out, and then we push off subsequently after that. So we want to be able to make sure that when we're moving into a hip extended position or in a hip extended position, we maintain the foot contacts that are relevant to that. That would be primarily the heel, the inner heel specifically, and this first metatarsal head. But that doesn't mean we're rolling onto the inside edge of the foot and losing outside foot contact. The whole foot should remain flat. But we want to educate the body that, hey, when I'm pushing off or moving into hip extension, or when I'm in hip extension, I need to make sure that I can find my heel, but also my first metatarsal head right here, because that's what's necessary for me to transition to propulsion and hip extension. So we want the foot to work with the hip. This is what a lot of people miss. They're oftentimes just in this glute bridge position, not paying any attention to what their feet are doing, and they're just moving up and down into that position, but that's not necessarily optimal in my opinion. And the big difference here is cueing and knowing what to feel and how to feel it. Because you can have the right exercise, you can have the perfect program, but if you can't feel and find the right things and integrate the foot with the hip, like we try to do and cue effectively in my programs, like my beginner body restoration program, then ultimately this is what's going to make the difference between success and failure. This is true whether we want to go after the hamstrings or the glutes first. But let's break down how we can bias each of those in this bridge position. Let's start with the hamstrings because they're usually easier to get and start with. If I want to get these hamstrings working to create that hip extension, then I want to not move up into too much hip extension. I want to focus on just creating that tilt genuinely with the hamstrings. And that means I need to focus on the cue of dragging my heel towards my butt. I can use an external reference to accomplish this more effectively, such as a dumbbell in between, wedged in between my heel and also my butt cheek. That will give me something to drag into. And this is how I would cue it. We can constrain ourselves into a better position. So what we can do is we can start with just the hamstrings. I like to with a lot of people because this educates the hamstrings to get a nice tilt of the pelvis and begin to work us into hip extension. And then we can progress to a full glute bridge. So we can get a ball that will allow our knees to stay in line with our toes and also our hips. It shouldn't be so wide that it's shoving the knees out, and it shouldn't be so small that it's collapsing the knees together. It should be about the right size so that this is aligned. And we have a couple of dumbbells in between the heels and the butt cheeks on each side. And now all we're gonna do is keep the whole foot flat. And we're gonna focus on dragging the heels into those dumbbells, which is going to turn on our hamstrings, and we're going to tilt our pelvis. So the best possible cue I like here is imagine that your spine is a piece of Velcro. Just peel off one vertebrae at a time. And for this starting position, it doesn't require much. Maybe just a couple of those vertebrae so that your tailbone gets off of the ground, but your low back stays completely flat. If you do that, just holding the ball in place, you're gonna feel a lot of hamstrings, and you're gonna learn how you can get that hip extension, that posterior tilt that should happen in hip extension as a result of using your hip extensors in the right way. But that same cue of being a piece of Velcro, being pulled off one vertebrae at a time is gonna be really important here, because otherwise we're just going to move into our end range hip extension position and just arch our back, and that's not what we want. So we wanna make sure the glutes do their job, and the glutes do create this posterior tilt and hip extension. So that's what we wanna make sure we're getting here. This is how I would cue it. Now, if you want to progress to a full glute bridge, keep that ball in between the knees to make sure things stay aligned. But now it's more of a push. So what you want to focus on is the first metatarsal head and the inner heel. So on my foot right here, and right here where the ball of the big toe is. It's not your actual big toe, it's right in here. Now that doesn't mean I roll onto the inside of that and lose my outside foot. We're still keeping the whole foot flat, but that's where about 2/3 of our pressure is going to be on each foot. Now the same cue applies. Exhale through your mouth and get a couple of the vertebrae off of the ground, pushing through the arch of the feet. Those foot contacts, you're gonna feel your glutes engage. Now, inhale through your nose, pause that position, exhale, couple more vertebrae, being that piece of Velcro. And you're going to peel off more and more. You're gonna get to a position where you can't go any higher after a couple of breaths, or else you're gonna extend your back. Well, that's your end range hip extension. Go back down, and then over time, you can work into more and more hip extension as you get better at this. You'll know you're at your end range because, well, your back is going to start working, and you're gonna feel that. But not only that, your ribs are gonna start flaring. So you're gonna feel that pop out, your belly's gonna pop up, and now you're using your low back to substitute for hip extension because you passed your end range hip extension. Now you need to use something else, and for most people, that's their low back. These changes in your cueing and positioning can lead to dramatically better changes in your ability to get back hip extension and take stress off of your low back, and also help you with things like knee pain and hip pain, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video.